Everybody to our webinar today, a conversation on kudzu. When research intersects with management, good things happen. This webinar is hosted by the Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Network. And we're going to have two speakers today, Dr. Stephen Enloe, who's a professor and extension specialist at the University of Florida IFAS Center for Aquatic and Invasive Plants, and Steve Manning, president of the Pacific Northwest Invasive Plant Council and founder of Invasive Plant Control. This webinar today is very much in the spirit of RISC in that it's a joint conversation between an invasive species manager and an invasive species researcher. And what we really are seeking to do is bring together these two worlds to share experiences and information on a species that's moving into the Northeast. But before we dive into our great presentation, I just wanted to ask that everybody mute their lines unless you're speaking. We do have, we didn't make this a webinar because we wanted people to have the opportunity to talk rather than just chat. But in the meantime, please, while our presenters are presenting, keep your line muted. Once they're done presenting, or even in the middle of it, you're welcome to put your questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll be moderating the chat box and bringing those questions up at the end. Also, if you would like to say something, if you want to raise your hand, we'll call on people. So we really want this to be a discussion rather than just a presentation and without the audience participating. And as we're getting started here, I just wanted to, I'm having a hard time advancing my slides here. Hold on. I wanted to point out that this is a part of a series that we're hosting here at RISC this spring to try to get people to interact and talk about experiences with invasive species and climate change. So I wanted to encourage people to check out the coffee talk that we're going to have on April 8th from 12:30 to 1:30 that's focusing on embracing the future through resistance, resilience, and transformation. And also on May 5th, we'll be hosting a networking session together with the Mass ECAN, just to have conversations about invasive species and climate change management. I'd love to give just a little bit of background about RISC as we're getting started for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It was founded back in 2016 when a lot of managers were coming to us asking how to manage foreign biological invasions in light of climate change. We were asking what their research needs were. So at that time, I got together with Bethany Bradley from the University of Massachusetts and Tony Limorelli, and the RISC network was born thanks to a lot of great stakeholders and members who have been supporting this initiative ever since. Now, since that time, we've grown to over 600 members on our listservs, and we have a strong leadership team both at UMass here at Cornell University and also throughout the Northeast. The mission of the RISC network is to reduce the compounding effects of invasive species and climate change by synthesizing relevant science, communicating the needs of managers to researchers, building stronger scientist-manager communities, which is one of the things we're trying to do today as well, and conducting priority research. We do, our main areas of work are boundary spanning, so really connecting researchers and managers, conducting research that addresses some of the needs that managers have brought up to us. We try to synthesize and translate existing research, and then we promote communication and implementation by bringing groups together. And for those of you who aren't here in the Northeast, I just wanted to point out that since we founded the Northeast RISC in 2016, we've also had other regions developing RISC, and we all are working collaboratively and independently. But if you're coming from the North Central region or Pacific Islands or the Northwest, there are currently RISCs that are being established and are working to address these needs. And also the Southeast, down in our speakers region, they're also working to establish a RISC network. So we just invite you to check out our website and our resources. And thank you all for coming here today. With that, I'm going to pass it to our speakers so we can start really learning about some of the great work that they're doing with kudzu as we're thinking about it more here in the Northeast. So go ahead and share your screen, Stephen, and thanks so much.
All right. Okay, let's get the PowerPoint ready here. Okay, everybody see the PowerPoint's okay? We good?
Well,
Yep, we can see it.
Yes, we can see it. Thanks.
Excellent, excellent. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Among the participant list, I see some familiar faces here, and this is very cool. I also see a lot of folks I don't know. So my name is Stephen Enloe, professor at the University of Florida. And Carrie asked me to join in and do this presentation and told me to find a land manager. And as I started thinking about this, I realized there is absolutely no better person to get to join me as a partner on this than Steve Manning with invasive plant control. Steve has an exceptional track record and resume on invasive plant management issues. And him and I have worked together for many, many years now. We co-authored an invasive plant management guide for the Southeast with Dr. Jim Miller, and have partnered up with his innovations conference in Nashville. And he's just generally a good guy. So what we're going to do is not split out this presentation, but actually have a conversation. And we're going to go back and forth. I'm going to share my slides. We're going to go through these and talk. And at the end of it, we hope to really stimulate a lot of good discussion among the larger audience here regarding this issue of kudzu. Okay, so here we go. Steve, you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
All right. Okay, there we go. Okay, so when we think about kudzu, what images come to mind, Steve? You know, this is one of those crazy plants in the southeastern United States, one of the worst invaders. What really comes to mind when you see images like this?
Yeah, I think about driving through Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, and this is what you see. As you start to go a little further north, or you go out west and there's kudzu, you kind of have to search for it a little bit more. So I think the original thought that was vines that are crawling over, climbing up trees, climbing over buildings, kind of taking over a forest, taking over a field.
Absolutely. This is down from Dadeville, Alabama, and it's just like that classic picture, abandoned mobile home completely engulfed in kudzu. We have all these pictures through the Bugwood Network people have taken creatively over time to show kudzu growing over equipment like a Caterpillar tractor here, overtaking cars. So we have all these incredible visual images of this plant with just what are perceived to be tremendous negative impacts. And these stick with us. I lived in Alabama for 7 years and spent a lot of time driving around the Southeast, a lot of work on kudzu there. And just the impact of these images, across landscapes, just really have driven home kind of our mindset on kudzu just from it being a bad plant. And, here you see a picture from the off season, from the winter dormant season. Steve, you snapped this picture. But it's pictures like that kind of lead to this idea that kudzu was indeed the vine that ate the South. Steve, can you remember the first time you heard that term used?
I would say we've been in business for 25, 30 years now doing this. I would say this is one of the first plants anybody ever heard of. And here, this is how it eats the South. Plant kudzu, you get in a running stance, throw the seed the opposite direction and run as fast as you can, or it'll catch up to you. I would say it's one of the original plants that people really, just the most visual in the South that you can see. So people really understand. When you ask someone, do you know what an invasive plant is? This will be the first one they talk.
Absolutely. And among the general public perception of invasive plants, again, really started with kudzu for a lot of folks. And so we have that long history of calling it invasive here in the Southeast. However, our culture has changed, our public perceptions of things have changed, and it wasn't too long ago that we had a whole different view of kudzu. And we go back to the history of kudzu here in the U.S., introduced into the Philadelphia Exposition in 1876, promoted in the early 1900s as a suitable forage plant. And then by the 1920s and 30s, our mindset again shifted into soil stabilization and protection of our soil resource. And so conservation of highly erodible soils due to a lot of bad farming practices was really our mindset. And so, we pushed hard and promoted kudzu as a great soil stabilizer. And, I got this slide set from Mike Henshaw with Alabama Cooperative Extension. Kudzu provides productive work for idle lands. We crowned kudzu kings and queens in the Southeast. We had kudzu festivals. So for a time period there from the 30s to the 40s, we promoted kudzu tremendously on what was the social media at the time, via news and radio. And so, yeah, we had just an incredibly different mindset of kudzu. And Steve, if I had been a professor, say at Auburn back in the 1930s, I might have been the one writing these publications to promote kudzu because that was our thinking. And you might have been running the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps crew that was out planting kudzu on eroded lands back in that time period. And, when we think about that, this picture that was from 1939 still just resonates very powerful with me because we see this exact same situation today. And so the reality is a lot of kudzu we have on the landscape today is a relic of former plantings. And we know that very well as millions of cuttings of kudzu were distributed. And over, I think at least somewhere between 1 and 3 million acres were actually planted as farmers were paid $8 an acre to plant kudzu during that time period. So that's
really interesting to see this. It would be really interesting to see this field today as well. My guess is it's perfectly clean. It's probably being used as a crop of some sort, and to the ability to control this plant once it's out of control as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So, we have this history, beautiful flowers, very fragrant. I don't know if you've actually spent any time to smell the flowers of kudzu when it blooms, but it's got an incredible bloom. Also makes a fantastic kudzu jelly. I don't know, have you ever had kudzu jelly, Steve?
I've had kudzu jelly. We've had several other kudzu foods at the Kudzu Festival in North Carolina one year.
So you've actually been to a kudzu festival.
They have kudzu festivals, kudzu weddings, kudzu many things. I can't say they've been there in the last 15 years, but they actually had one or a series of those over the years. So
yeah. So yeah, we have these cultural ties to kudzu. It's pretty amazing. In addition, more recently, researchers have really been digging into sort of the medicinal benefits of kudzu. And there's been some good reviews on looking back at some of the more ancient Chinese traditional uses and other Southeast Asian medicinal uses, and are starting to verify some of the benefits of kudzu in terms of, its prospective medicinal benefits. And so some of that's being verified. And there's been a real push, in terms of ethnobotany and towards increasing interactions and increasing work on understanding plants like kudzu and exactly how they may be medicinally beneficial. So again, our thinking changes again. Now, Steve, when I ask you just how troublesome is kudzu, I'm just going to go ahead and throw this out there. Is it in your top 10 of hard to control invasives?
No, and I let me explain that a little bit. So we have crews that are out there working every day, 8-10 hours a day with different types of tools and equipment. And when we look at a plant, there's lots of ways to determine its invasiveness. We look at it in terms of difficulty to control, because that's how we're going to have to understand our timing and control methods and everything. If I have kudzu and I have a list of 50 invasive plants, it's probably going to be closer to number 50 than the number 1 most difficult to control. It's not hard to control. We know how to do it. We know how to manage it. We know how long it takes. It just takes the effort of doing it. I think it just visually scares a lot of people. Now, how troublesome is it in terms of if I'm seeing it in my property in the Northeast and it hasn't been up there before? It's troublesome enough that I would do some quick rapid response, control it, not just look at it, put it on a map and determine, how we're going to tell people about it. So it's a problem, and it gets out of control, and it grows really fast, and it will outcompete just about everything that's there. But once it's there, it's actually really easy to control.
Yeah. Okay. So historically, it took until the 1950s to actually declare it a weed. So within about 2 decades from the NRCS, or the Soil Conservation Service at that time, promoting it, before they sort of began to call it a weed. And it was much, much later that kudzu was added to the federal noxious weed list. And then it was removed from the federal noxious weed list. It is on several state noxious weed lists. So it is a regulated species within certain states. We additionally have done risk assessments. So I see Dr. Dia Lawrence is on here. And, for the IFAS assessment, Dr. Lawrence has conducted that and run kudzu through her screening process and concluded it has high invasion risk for the state of Florida. Other states have done similar approaches. USDA IFAS has worked on this. And so, from a science and data-based approach, we've definitely concluded that kudzu can indeed be a very invasive plant. There's been sort of on the flip side of that, we've had naturalists like Bill Finch come to the table, publishing articles in Smithsonian Magazine, sort of saying that the whole kudzu invasive thing is kind of overblown, and that it's not really the problem that a lot of us have sort of suggested that it has been. So, we have some varying opinion. I'm not saying there's a growing consensus to suggest it's not invasive, but this is the reality of science. And one thing that I really, one take home message, Steve, that I hope we get across today is just the idea that we need transparency in science on this invasive issue. And that as we learn more and more about invasive species, we need to really work hard in educating the public on why our perceptions of species may change over time. So I think that's really important. And right now we're sort of kind of caught between caught in the crossfire between some strong different opinions on kudzu, its potential invasiveness. But when we take a look at EDMAPS, sort of the current distribution, now this is voluntary distribution data, so this is not absolutely perfect. But when you take a look at, the kudzu distribution here in the US, Steve, what are some things that jump out to you about this map?
Well, first of all, that I know that these maps aren't complete. I know a lot of species on these maps we look at that are not listed. And I can say just honestly myself, just looking at Tennessee, that you could probably fill in Tennessee.
Yes.
So we know that it's spreading, and we know that it's moving in the various ways that it does.
Yeah, it's those 2 little green points, or 3 green counties up in the Pacific Northwest. You've had a lot of interaction up in the Pacific Northwest. Have you ever actually seen those kudzu patches?
I've seen one of them, yes. And I'll tell you, when you go to where kudzu originated and you look at a patch of kudzu, it's pretty sparse. There's natural enemies that control it. You can really see where it's just kind of sparse, and there's not a real density to it. That's how it looked when I saw the patches in the Northwest. It was something very simple. It was something that could be managed quickly within a day. I haven't seen it since then, so I don't know. Some of them might have. There's probably more now. I see a lot more dots on the map than I did back then. There was only 1 dot when I first, it was actually up in Washington, not in Oregon.
Yeah.
So we know it's there. We know the climate's there that will allow it to grow. And we also know that it could really take over some areas. So yeah, it's
yeah. So
covering a lot of ground in Oregon.
Oh yeah, and I agree with that. And what I see on this map is a clear classic invasion front. So we have a problem that was well established in the Southeast, and we have what we call these outlier patches in the surrounding, from Texas, Oklahoma, let's see, and then all the way up around into the Northeast. And amazingly enough, several years back, that first patch was detected across our border in the north side of Lake Erie there. And I remember when NPR called me to interview me about that patch that had been detected up there. And I was actually standing out in a kudzu field in Alabama the day I got that call to discuss the invasion of kudzu all the way into Canada at that point. So yes, we do clearly have evidence of kudzu being detected more and more northward with some westward expansion. Certainly some ideas there that that kudzu is responding to some elements of climate change. And so to be talking about it for this group is extremely appropriate. Now, excuse me. I looked on the participant list and I happened to see Matt Fry is actually logged in here. So I got to give him some props. He's got a great PowerPoint on his website, Lessons Learned from 6 Years of Kudzu Research. And I kind of want to highlight him in this process as a graduate student at Delaware, working with Judith Hugh Goldstein on biological control options, hope for Kudzu. He did some really good basic biology work. And what's really fascinating from an academic perspective, and immersing myself at Auburn University and the heart of Kudzu, quickly realized that there'd been a lot taken for granted regarding our understanding of Kudzu. And we had folks like Matt Fry come along that really began to ask these questions outside of the Southeast per se. And so if you Google lessons learned from 6 years of Kudzu research, it'll take you right to his PowerPoint, which is a really, really nice kind of story, his story about his research and work on Kudzu. So Matt, I'm throwing you a little bit of props there. Good job. And some of his overall findings that he sort of pulled out of some of his work. He found limited seed germination, germinability, limited seed viability. He found seedlings were kind of a little bit wimpy, and he rarely found them at any of his field sites. He found tremendous vegetative growth and production of Kudzu, and also found that defoliation was extremely effective at really knocking it back. And so, he really did some really nice basic biology work. I'm very appreciative to that, and I would definitely advocate that we certainly need more of this, especially along the invasion front of Kudzu. So let's jump academically into a few things about Kudzu and as an invasive species. And we have a number of characteristics and traits of plants that we find are common across a lot of invasive species. And we ask the question, does Kudzu really sort of hold up in terms of some of those things? We often think about, high seed production, so making lots and lots of seed. Well, it turns out Kudzu can make a ton of seed. It's been documented up to 1,800 seed, I think, per square meter being produced from some really thick patches. However, a lot of those seed end up being non-viable. And so it turns out that there's a lot of natural predation on seed pods as they're being developed by a lot of our native insects here in the US. So we also know that Kudzu is very hard seeded, high degree of dormancy that we do not academically understand very well at all. We know we can scarify and break some of that dormancy and overcome that and facilitate seed germination. But we also know that those seedlings are not extremely competitive. And so we know that, compared to other invasives that have extremely fast growing seedlings, have a very short juvenile stage there, just doesn't quite seem to hold up for Kudzu along those lines. So there's a lot we have to learn about the seed biology. And I would say on the invasion front of Kudzu, with longer distance dispersal, clearly seed are a major potential vector or potential way of this invasive plant spreading. And Matt also found there was some variation in seed viability and germination, I think, between some different populations from New York to Delaware. And so the question has arisen, well, are the genetics changing? And if so, then this certainly bodes a careful look at Kudzu and to take it very seriously on this invasion front. Now, what Matt also found, and folks like Dr. Jim Miller here and others, was the incredible important nature of the Kudzu crown and Kudzu tubers. Historically, there was tremendous misunderstanding of where Kudzu grows and regrows from. And Steve, I don't know if you ever saw this picture, but Jim Miller drew it literally on a napkin. He drew this beautiful picture of the way Kudzu spreads via vines rooting at the nodes, forming new root crowns, and then continuing to grow and expand, asexually that way. Did you ever happen to see that kind of back of the napkin?
Yeah, I did. And that tells you that's a true, someone that was really trying to understand what he was doing. And I really appreciated Jim a lot and his research on this.
Yeah, just a huge nod to Dr. Miller and all of his contributions through the USDA Forest Service. He was really, one of the leaders in bringing Kudzu to the forefront of ecological attention. Oh boy, way back in the 80s and 90s, really, in terms of dealing with this. But he explained to people the tubers don't regenerate. So when you are removing kudzu, you don't have to dig the tubers out. We simply have to sever those root crowns where the new buds arise to form new shoots. And so clearly, asexually, this is a very aggressive plant. It's got a lot of gas in the tank, we like to say, through the tubers that are capable of regenerating a lot of new vine growth. And that is often the big frustration of anybody who does control work. Steve, how many sites have you seen or did you deal with where somebody said they tried to do something about kudzu, but it just grew back and they just kind of gave up?
Well, most sites that we visit, I think that's not just a kudzu problem, that's an invasive species problem, because people think they can do it in 1 year because they see it disappear from whatever their treatment method is. They don't realize it takes a lot of years of management to fully eradicate something. With kudzu, it could take 5 to 10 years to get a site really clean.
Yeah. So that's an educational thing that still requires a lot of effort to overcome sort of just a misunderstanding of the way a lot of invasive plants grow, including kudzu. And here's a great picture of the sort of the root crown of kudzu, and you can see all the vine growth originating from that top few centimeters where the actual buds are that they originate from. You can see a tuber growing down vertically downwards from that, where energies are stored. You can see a couple of folks here from Lake Aquatic Park who have actually used a weed wrench to pull those tubers up, and you can see how phenomenally big these are. And if you Google kudzu tubers, you will see that they are often produced, and they're massive, absolutely massive. Now, when I was younger, a younger researcher, I heard often people tell these stories about excavating kudzu tubers that were the size of Volkswagens. Steve, what's the biggest kudzu tuber you ever actually ran across?
We never did a lot of excavating. I think that's part of the misconception of what you have to do with kudzu. You don't have to get an excavator out there and dig out your property. So honestly, what you're showing me here is probably one of the bigger ones I've seen, just because a lot of the work gets done from the ground up, not from, you're doing things to the root system, but you're not having to dig that out.
Yeah, these are huge, but I've never seen the Volkswagen sized ones. So
if I had my employees using weed wrenches to control kudzu, I would have no employees. Let's just put it that way.
Now, our friends here at Lake Aquatic, they learned about the kudzu root crown issue very shortly after doing this work, and so they quickly moved on from this. So props, they learned the science of it, and they really started doing it right with the crowns. But they got some great pictures here, and we appreciate that. So thank you.
Absolutely.
In terms of shoot biology, this is another thing. As a smothering vine, we see the tremendous leaf area and invasive characteristics here. Kudzu makes lots and lots of leaf area. And what we find is incredible allocation to cheap leaves as opposed to structure. And so it doesn't invest tons and tons in the vines themselves. It really puts a lot of energy into the leaves. And so its capability of rapid growth, up to say 30 centimeters a day, is due to its allocation and investment in cheap leaves. And so, yes, we have good data on that aspect of it, and which is why it's such a smothering plant. Now, let's move on to impacts. And when we think about what do we know regarding kudzu's true documented ecological impacts? So just from an observational standpoint, Steve, you've walked through a ton of kudzu patches. What do you see growing underneath all that smothering mat?
Invasive plants. So, kudzu grows a lot in the south, so we see a lot of Chinese privet. We see a lot of, believe it or not, other vines. We'll have euonymus, vinca minor, vinca major might be growing underneath there. I'd say more often than not, though, it's multiflora rose or Chinese privet.
Yeah, so two other highly undesirables there. So, and there's good data out there supporting the negative impacts on native plant communities. We're not without that. We know that about a decade ago, the kudzu bug appeared in Georgia and has rapidly spread across the southeast. We hoped it might be a biocontrol agent, but it turns out it likes soybeans just as much as it likes kudzu. And so kudzu is, an alternate host for a major pest of soybeans now. We know that it's a legume. We know that it fixes nitrogen. very nicely, and there are concerns regarding nitrogen loading into ecosystems. And we also know it's very high in terms of isoprene emissions, resulting in potential local ozone pollution. There's been some interesting predictive modeling there suggesting just how much ozone pollution can occur because of kudzu. And so there's good data there for ecosystem impacts. And Steve, here's a picture you shared with me. You want to talk about this a little bit?
Sure. This is along the Natchez Trace Parkway in Mississippi. And this is very representative of how it's been over the years along that stretch. It's just areas where kudzu started small and it's just grown and grown and hasn't been managed over time.
So if you think if we were to dig that up and find a lot of nodules for nitrogen fixation, I suspect there's definitely some potential for watershed loading there of nitrogen, especially downslope on these hilly areas. Now, we need more data on that. That's clearly something that needs to be better understood. But I think the evidence is there for it. And probably the most important impact that we could say that we deal with is kudzu on rights of ways. So if you've driven around the Southeast, then you've often driven down roads where the kudzu is literally draped over every sign. It is hanging out of the trees. It's blocking your view of around curves. It's really getting into the safety recovery zone on roadsides. It is growing up the power lines. That's a tremendous amount of weight being applied to those power lines. And so it turns out that our rights of way folks spend a lot of resources managing kudzu, keeping it off the power lines, keeping it out of the safety recovery of zone, keeping it off signposts, keeping it off infrastructure in general. And so the impact there is tremendous in terms of the economics. And I know we have good data on that too. So, we have some data clearly showing it's invasive. We understand quite a bit about its biological characteristics. I think we still have a lot to learn, especially along the invasion front. We know impact-wise in many areas of the Southeast, tremendous negative impacts locally. And we know that a lot of people have been very frustrated with management over time. So a lot of people have expressed historically tremendous frustration in their inability to manage kudzu. So, what can we do about it? Should we just give up? So Steve, just sort of take us through your mindset when it comes to kudzu management and sort of what your overall framework is when thinking about it.
Sure. So what's the next slide, Steve? Remind me.
Oh, okay. Before you jump into that, we got to give props to one more individual here. Many of you may have known this man. His name was Newt Hardy. He passed away a few years ago. And he was phenomenal, because I want to tell you that he was a living testimony for many years that you can make a difference against invasive plants. So Newt retired and basically started the Kudzu Coalition in 2004 at the age of 69. Okay, so in his retirement, he decided to not sit at the beach drinking margaritas, but actually founded the Kudzu Coalition in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Not only did he just found that, he really worked out a removal technique he called the Kudzu Chop. And he is credited with successfully eradicating kudzu at over 41 urban areas within Spartanburg, South Carolina. His legacy continues today, as there's continued efforts at least 102 different sites around Spartanburg, South Carolina. So I will tell you, you can make a difference. A single person can make a difference against invasive plants. And when you bring people together, you can make an even bigger difference. And so I sort of like to give props to Newt Hardy and everything he accomplished in the Kudzu Coalition that continues today. Now, back to you, Steve. So,
Sure.
You got a site like this, it almost looks impossible. So what's your mindset here?
Okay. And since you have control of the scroll there, feel free to scroll as I go along here to kind of show some of the tools.
Sure.
But when I look at a site, when I think about kudzu, the first thing is just like any invasive species, we're looking to see what's desirable in there. We also have to consider where we are, because the way we control kudzu in Mississippi might be different than the way we're going to control kudzu in New York. There might be some seasonal differences. It might be temperature. It might be the way chemical works in a place like that, and versus the South. It might be many other variables. So we really have to consider a lot of different variables. So I'm going to kind of generally talk about some of the options that are available when we look at these different sites. But like you can see on this particular slide, we have to consider all of the options. Depending on the area we're working, it might be chemical, it might be biological, physical, cultural. But if you go back that one slide, Steve, real quick. There you go. When we look at a site like this, the first thing I look at in terms of going into this particular site, this was in Chattanooga. It's Lookout Mountain, actually, which is right next to Chattanooga, Tennessee. This is a big curve that, you know, thousands of people drive this area every day. So it's a really visible site. And we kind of wanted to educate people on what we were doing there, because kudzu is a very visible plant in the Chattanooga area. The first thing you do is look at this site, figure out what's underneath those, you know, what trees are underneath this kudzu. Are any of them alive? What native plants might be there? It's not just saying, hey, this chemical kills kudzu, let's spray it. It's what's underneath and what are we trying to save here? Is there anything? You know, is it Chinese privet and multiflora rose? Or are there oak trees and other things underneath there that still have some life in them that we have to be careful of? So there are cases where you'll go in and maybe actually trim the vines off those trees that you see in the center there before you go in and do any spraying or any other type of work. Most of the time we will go along the edge of the infestation and use some type of trimmer or hedge clipper to actually cut it at eye level. We call it giving kudzu a haircut. So once we get the haircut in, the vines that are hanging on the tree will just decay pretty quickly over time and go away. And then it's on the ground. So instead of pointing your nozzle in the air and spraying up high, you're spraying everything on the ground if you're using a chemical approach. It also allows you, if you're grazing or using other methods, for the animals to actually get in there a little easier and work their way through it. So yeah, we'd follow that up with some type of a treatment, whether it's, you know, the physical aspect or the chemical aspect. The extension and the outreach is really important. So when you see the signs we put up in the areas we work, if there's high visibility, it's very important to make sure that people are understanding what you're doing. You'll have a lot of people that don't like the method you're using, but you need to really explain. If you're using an herbicide out there, explain how it's not just herbicide use. You know, there's many other methods that you're throwing in there as well. There's a lot of physical and non-chemical control methods that are involved in the control as well. So
yeah, when I look at this map, and it's sort of what I've outlined here, or what I call focus areas needed for outreach and extension, and it's on that invasion front. You know, you can sort of preach to the choir if you get down to the southeast on kudzu, but in terms of this invasion front, this is an audience that may not be very familiar with it. And, you know, and in terms of extension efforts here, some of the most important things that we can really do is convey a message of, hey, we have a known invasive plant from the southeast that can cause significant trouble. It is moving into our area, and we don't really fully understand what it's capable of here yet, but we recognize that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And it's really worth educating folks and learning and becoming aware of what the potential may be. And as the science moves forward and helps clarify that, then we are literally, you know, ready to have already begun to deal with it from an early detection rapid response. So Steve, have you ever actually done the Kudzu Chop from a physical control perspective?
Only in small portions like this, because you might be researching an area and trying to understand how things are growing.
So
to control an entire population.
Yeah, so Newt Hardy kind of worked this technique out of actually identifying the root crowns and severing them either with a saw or a sharp, you know, a Pulaski tool, something like this that just cuts the root crown below. I will say they get relatively very lignified tissue, and they can be really hard to cut through. And I think that saws are better than chopping devices in general. I think they're a little safer and probably more effective. But if you look at the picture on the bottom right-hand corner, every green flag in that small, like 10 by 15 foot area, there was a identified kudzu root crown. And so you can see just how many root crowns kudzu had put down on that very small area. So to engage in this type of physical removal of even the Kudzu Chop or sawing root crowns to really dense infestations, you are really asking for a tremendous amount of work to get started. So if you want to go with the physical, just account for that and recognize it's going to be a lot of labor to get in there to remove, you know, kudzu from very dense infestations like this.
But I do have to say it's important to point that out, because especially when you're
Yeah.
a wave of new infestations of a plant, you have very small populations, and there are a lot of people that don't want to use herbicides. They don't want to deal with the chemical aspect of it. So if you can get it when it's small, I was just speaking with someone this morning up in Northern Virginia that's dealing with bamboo. They're dealing with 100 stems, so they're trying to do it more mechanically. Now, if there's
Absolutely.
1,000 stems, you don't have that option. So it's really important to know that.
Yeah, I agree. Physical control is the first line of defense for very small incipient infestations. I 100% advocate for that.
Yep.
We have larger scale tools that people have played with, like Kudzilla here, looking at sort of like a root crown rake, modified skid steers to lift and excavate those up out of the ground. And, they've been effective on small patches, and often as a way of sort of doing a lot of the heavy lifting early on, which would then be followed up by a lot of other intensive ground efforts. Cutting wise, I show this picture. A lot of folks have mowed kudzu, but back in the early 1900s, they recognized that repeated mowing of kudzu could actually deplete its energy reserves in the tubers and subsequently kill it out. And so, yes, we have known that. What I tend to find is mowing of kudzu along roadsides doesn't get it all. You don't mow everything. And so it is able to continuously regrow back into the previously mowed area. And so you may not have huge root crowns in that area, but they're always encroaching back into the area. So we do know repeated mowing or defoliation events can definitely significantly knock kudzu back. Folks, we utilize these types of mulching machines to get access into kudzu stands and other invasive plants. Again, these are, a way of really gaining access to a site and creating very open conditions that you can navigate through. Steve, how often do y'all use these types of mulchers in your work?
We use them relatively frequently, and it's for different reasons in different plants than kudzu. It might be a 200-acre patch of bush honeysuckle that has no other desirable species around, so we knock it down and foliar spray the regrow. But yeah, in a scenario like this, I would come in and just trim that off with a hedge clipper, be done with it in a few minutes. But we did just plan for a project in South Carolina where we will have a mulching machine go underneath the kudzu, because it's so inaccessible, because it's full of Chinese privet. So in order for us to get from one end of that kudzu patch to the other in this big ravine, we have to walk through it with a long hose. We have to have a path. So they're going to come through and actually masticate a lot of that for us before we get into it. So
yeah. So Steve, you have worked with, you've really been on the cutting edge of a lot of different types of tools for invasive plant control. And this picture is kind of a montage, or a collage, I should say, of some different things. You want to sort of run people through kind of what some of these are?
Sure. So, and these are just a few of the tools, and you don't really see the results from what they can do, but whether it's hot water treatments, steam, foam treatments, or chemical, applicator tools that get you into help you access an area a lot easier. There's a lot of really great versions of tools out there. It's really important to understand that there's great tools out there, and sometimes you have to adapt. You might use 4 different tools for one project. When you really think about that slide that Stephen showed you in Mississippi along the parkway, there's water there. So you have to think about the chemical you're going to be using. You also have to think about the machinery you're going to be using, how you're going to get around the kudzu and water in an area where it might have some water issues. They're just pine trees. Are there other types of trees that we have to watch out for? What are the native forbs, things around there? So sometimes you're using non-chemical, sometimes you're using chemical, but you're usually using them all in one control project, just from percentages.
Yeah, and another point to this is, innovations in invasive plant management is something that we're all kind of desperate for. And, it's really good to see that you are getting out there and finding new technologies and working on those and applying those as every chance you get, and learning to use them and how to make them effective. So this
and all of these that are on the screen right now are non-chemical methods. These are all, believe hot water or steam are what we're looking at here. So,
Yeah.
and they work in certain scenarios. I would not, there's not many options there for kudzu yet that we know of. The root system is just too deep. You're not going to get into it, but it would work similar to how a goat works on kudzu. You just
Yeah,
trying to knock it back. So.
Carrie, we're probably about 5 minutes, so we will wrap this up in the next 5 minutes. I promise you, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions here. So
Okay.
what are goats? And goats have been really touted as a way to remove all kinds of vegetation and different invasive plants. They are highly promoted. They are very charismatic, and unfortunately, we still need a lot more research on goats and herbivores in general. We recognize kudzu is extremely palatable for all classes of grazing animals, and that cows, horses, sheep, well, even pigs will go after kudzu. So the bottom line is, it is extremely high quality protein forage for all kinds of animals. And in the case of goats, there's a lot of small independent businesses that have sort of risen up using goats for veg management of all kinds of things, including kudzu. A lot of cities, and especially in Tennessee, have jumped on board with places like Chattanooga, getting contracts with local goat grazers for management of kudzu in all sorts of park-like conditions. And Steve, you've worked with a lot of these folks before. They come out to your innovations conference. What do you think the take-home message on goats is right now?
Well, there's a few. First of all, the public loves to see the goats out there, and they ask questions.
Yeah.
Great educational tool. You'll get thousands of people walking up asking what we're doing, especially if it's the time that they're having their small, they're babies. Then they get
yeah.
We use goats in the past to clear areas to make it easier to control the next season. So we've used sheep or goats in that capacity, because if you look at a big kudzu field, it's just, you don't know what obstacles are underneath it, and it can be relatively dangerous. And we've stepped on everything from, rattlesnakes to, 20-foot deep holes that you don't realize, or rusted out cars or whatever it might be. Heck, we've had wild boar chase us through the Smoky Mountains in kudzu. So they actually are really good at cleaning it out and making it easier to come through the next year. It's an alternative to the mulching machine you showed a minute ago. Kind of gets, they knock things out and make it easier the next year.
Yeah. Now we know that from experience that grazing animals will sort of graze out kudzu over a 3 to 4 year period of very intensive kind of overgrazing on a site. So grazing is often promoted, overgrazing to completely eradicate kudzu. There's a ton of nuances associated with the technical aspects of grazing animals. And I'd say they're almost as technical or more technical as other management approaches. I mean, I think you got to know more. You need more technical knowledge to use a goat than you do an herbicide. And so just know and understand that they're not a silver bullet, and they can be extremely beneficial and useful, but they do require a lot of technical input. And to wrap this up, Steve, let's jump into herbicides here. So we're just about out of time here. And I'll be happy to stay on and answer herbicide questions afterwards. But Steve, why don't you just sort of run through your thought process on herbicides and kind of the way you go about it?
Sure. So again, this is very, very dependent upon where you are. It's very site specific. It's one of the easiest ways to control kudzu over time. You just have to be very careful, like with any herbicide or any chemical, how you're applying it, what are the ramifications of using them. We very seldomly get away from Transline or Garlon 3A, so clopyralid or triclopyr. Sometimes we'll use glyphosate, depending on where we are and what we're trying to do. It takes multiple applications. Usually the first year you knock it out, it kind of really works its way into the root system. By year 2, you usually will see some regrowth. It'll be relatively dense, but you can tell it's not as dense as it was the year prior. And then by year 3, it's getting to where you're seeing 25% of what you originally saw. By year 4, you're down to maybe 5. And then from that point forward, you're treating little outliers here and there. Steve, scrolling through some pictures of drone sprayers, aerial spray techniques. There's not a lot of capacity in drone sprayers right now, so it's not a great way to do it, but it is an option that's coming around, and we will have a lot better options in the very near future, I think. Aerial control with helicopters works as well. We use RTVs that have anywhere from 150 to 300-foot hoses on them. They also have remote controls that you can reel in the hose with remote control. You can turn off and on the sprayers. So, you know, basically you have to jump in with kudzu in a lot of places because you're on hillsides, cliffs, areas where it's pretty dangerous. So you have to be pretty careful. So we have to have the accessibility, basically. You can't just drive through most of this stuff. There are big fields where it's that way, but most of the time it's not. But when you're talking about new infestations, you just need to have the right kind of application equipment. There's different nozzle tips that you need to have, and we can get into more detail on that if anybody wants to call me and talk to me about it. We also have, you know, those bigger spray guns that work on bigger infestations. I saw one question come up about time of year for application. The best time to apply chemical on kudzu is when it's flowering. That's when it will bring it in the most. You have to be aware of several variables, such as drought. As it rained, you know, if the plant, if it hasn't gotten a lot of rain over the summer, it's probably not going to take in that chemical as well. So you kind of have to really pay attention to that as well. It's a lot better if it's rained the week before. But usually it's when it's flowering, and just the hottest time of the summer is usually the best time to treat kudzu.
Yeah, so you typically focus on triclopyr. Transline or clopyrrol is another option. That's probably the most selective option we have. It's not the strongest option, but it's definitely gives selectivity there, which is really nice. Escort's a forestry herbicide and right away. And Tordon is that classic one, probably not used as much anymore. A lot of folks have switched over to Milestone. And there's some interest in method, but that's really a non-crop, not a bare ground herbicide, but pretty darn close to that. And so it's fit in natural areas. Not quite sure, but we know it's got some pretty good efficacy. So, you know, one of the realities with any of these things is, and we're going to wrap this up, after treating, what I tend to find is no matter what the treatment, we reset succession. Okay. So in a lot of, especially old open fields. And so you can see here a shift releasing goldenrod. You know, here you can see from a Tordon treatment, you got a lot of broom sedge coming back with more grasses. You know, and in the case of method herbicide, actually creating blackberry patches. So the bottom line is, you know, all these are relatively early cereal species that are coming back after sort of being released from that intensive kudzu competition. So you got to understand that those successional processes start to kick back in following pretty intensive kudzu management. It doesn't immediately restore the forest. You know, that's going to take some time, but overall, depending upon what's in the seed bank and what's around, is kind of a lot of things are going to be coming back. So Steve, take us home with a couple of pictures here.
Sure. This is a property right next to the Smoky Mountains that was purchased for, I think, like $20,000 because there was kudzu on it. The property next door that didn't have kudzu, same size, same value, sold for $80,000. This was probably 20 years ago. People looked at that kudzu and thought that's going to be a fortune to control. You know, it took about $5,000 to control that kudzu. This was, I want to say, maybe a 10-acre area, something of that nature. Maybe it was a little bit less. So it's very manageable. It's very doable. You can see the forest is clean when you get back in there. This is the same site, just looking a different direction. Like I said, you never know what's underneath kudzu. You might have thought that was a tree, but there's an old homestead there and a nice rock wall. A lot of value to that property.
Yeah. So to summarize and wrap this up, our view of, you know, from a social cultural lens, our view of kudzu continues to change. There are books being written right now that are challenging our very paradigms of kudzu. I was just interviewed for a book coming out. You know, from an academic perspective, I think there's still a lot of study that needs to be done, especially along the invasion front. Props to folks like Matt Fry who have pioneered or continued that work. And here's to the next generation of graduate students to take up the cause. And, you know, from a management perspective, it's not an impossibility. Early detection, rapid response is still critical on the invasion front. Local patch eradication is definitely feasible. And as Steve has demonstrated in multiple projects, large-scale management is very, very feasible. So with that, we thank you for your time. There's some photo credits that I didn't actually get in some of the pictures. Thanks to everyone who provided photos. And with that, we'll take the rest of the time and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve and Stephen. That was a fantastic presentation. I learned so much, and I'm sure everyone in our audience did as well. We did go quite a bit over, and that's you were just sharing so much great information. I didn't want to stop you, but we've got about 5 minutes left. We have a lot of questions. If either of you would be willing to stay on a little bit past the hour, we can just keep going until
I'm here to answer questions. I will stay.
Great. So my colleague Jory's been managing the chat box. So go ahead, Jory, and you can start from the top. And then also if people would like to actually say their question, they can raise their hand. So maybe we'll alternate a little bit between chat box questions and raised hands.
Sounds good. So the first question that we had was this person said they're having success removing kudzu, but seeing Japanese hops moving in after they remove kudzu. Do you have any suggestions in managing this annual invasive?
I would
question. Go ahead, Steve.
That we would use, but I would probably prefer to speak in person and get some of the variables about the site in the area versus throwing out a general control approach. But most of the time, when you take out an invasive, another one's going to come in, so you have to be ready for that. So, you saw my email there. Give me an email. We can talk about that. Or call.
Bob Gale has his hand up, so Joy will throw it to him to verbally ask his question.
I've treated with Transline, and I haven't worked close to water, but I've been told I think it's not so good to use too close to water. But how, Steve, how would you recommend mulching water? How close to it? And
don't use Transline. That's one of the downsides of Transline. You don't want to use it close to the water sources.
So how close?
I think it's 100 yards. But you have to slope, and you have to look at what type of soil is it? Sandy? Is it clay? How is it going to run? So whenever we see water in an area, it might be an area where it dries up a certain time of the year, and that might be a different story. But my preference is to just not use Transline where there's water at any time of the year, because other options will get a control just as well. Sometimes it might take a little bit longer. Sometimes you have to be selective in different ways. Because Transline is legume specific, it gives you that benefit. But
right.
If you're using a Garland or something like that, just use 3A that's close to the water. That's
okay.
Use that. So.
Thanks.
That's your other question that I saw pop up in the questions. There was you're asking about insects and flowering and when to use herbicides. I'm going more specifically when's the best time to get the best kill on kudzu. But when you throw in other variables like that, absolutely do it right before flowering. Do it when you get the most foliage out there. That's your best time to do it. So.
Great, thanks.
Yep.
Go ahead, Jory, with our next question.
So this person said that, historically kudzu has been found in the late 1990s in Northeast and Central US and has been seen thriving in frost-prone areas in Ohio. What are your thoughts about kudzu distribution relying more on where it's been introduced versus climatic tolerances and range expansion?
Stephen, you want to jump on that one?
Okay. I was trying to look at that when. There we go. Okay. I'm sorry. I was just following that question. I was having trouble hearing you there. Okay. So, in terms of frost-prone areas, so yes, even in the Southeast, kudzu dies back every winter due to frost. So it does not tolerate killing frosts, and those vines do die back to the ground. It certainly seems that the shorter frost period that we have would certainly suggest that it's going to be capable of moving further and further northwards. And so, I think that climatic tolerance is, yes, it is frost intolerant, but it certainly is capable of surviving with frost and just going dormant over the winter. The predicted range is historic predicted range is somewhat close to what we see with the EdMaps distribution, but I think that's probably not, I don't think kudzu has realized its full geographic potential yet.
Great, thank you. Owen Carson, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks so much. I got kind of maybe it's a little more of a broader question, but I appreciate the presentation, and I was wondering how you, Stephen, approach jobs that that you're requested to scope for like kudzu control that are adjacent to properties that you don't have any control over and won't be working on, and how you decide whether or not to tell a client, yes, we can do this, or how do you factor that kind of jurisdictional boundary in? Obviously kudzu doesn't respect property boundaries.
Yeah, well, you have to work the boundaries that you have. And it's someone else that asked the question earlier, I saw pop up about what is cultural control? What's that example? This is a great example of that, where oftentimes when we have that scenario, and we almost always do, whatever species we're talking about, we have to start educating the neighborhood. We have to start educating, the property owners around. Sometimes you'll get response that's good, sometimes you won't. Oftentimes, when I'm working with certain species, if I go next door, the lady says, my husband planted that 60 years ago. I'm not taking that out. And I say, good, I wouldn't take it out either. Good for you. But eventually over time with education, the next homeowner might. So we have to just keep educating the landowners. Oftentimes we'll host trainings and workshops just for a certain area, just to get people involved that are maybe close to a certain project we're working on that's important. Here in Nashville, we have put together alliances and trainings and workshops so that the whole community, all of Nashville, knows what we're doing. And over time, people will start to understand why we're doing it themselves. So I think go ahead.
I'm sorry, as a quick follow-up on that, do you invite like regulatory agencies to those community gatherings too? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, and if you
look, because that's one of the most important players.
It absolutely is. And so we use different, we helped start the weed wrangles with the Garden Club of America. And that's something you guys can do anywhere in the country. And that's a great way to get people, neighbors involved, whether it's regulatory or just, a banker that's home on the weekend that wants to control his invasives. So over time, yeah, it's just been a wonderful way to get people involved and educate them. So that's a really, really key aspect to the cultural side of what we're talking about.
Great. I'm going to pass it back to Joy, but I just wanted to mention it is 2 minutes after 1. So if anyone needs to get off, this is being recorded, and we will keep the Q&A session recorded as well. So if you need to get off and you asked a question, I'm going to ask our speakers to go ahead and answer them, and then you can check the recording after we make it publicly available. Jory, go ahead with the next question.
Sure. Do you know, or do we have data on how quickly kudzu spreads?
Oh, I see that question is coming in from Iurella, and it's good to see you, Iurella. We haven't we chatted. It's been a while talking about kudzu. There is some data out there of say 30 centimeters a day in terms of vine spread. Forest inventory analysis data through the USDA Forest Service, has sort of taken a more larger scale approach to estimating rates of spread. And I'm sure that you have found some outrageous numbers, in terms of say 150,000 acres per year, all the way down to, maybe 2,500 acres per year. Honestly, I'm not sure you're going to get better data than the forest inventory analysis spread data that's out there. Everything else beyond that, I think, is probably some excessive extrapolation in a lot of cases, but I think that may be the best data set to go to for that. And if somebody else has done a better job, please let me know that I'm not aware of it. I don't mean to offend anyone if there's somebody else really working hard on kudzu spread, but I don't know of anybody right now.
Great, thanks.
Great.
Go ahead, Terry.
I'll just move along then. So this person is in Pittsburgh. We're seeing some kudzu patches in their parks there. What advice do you have specifically for younger, smaller patches in northern climates?
Oh, that's easy to answer. Physical control, identifying the root crowns, sawing, taking a saw beneath the root crowns and removing those. You don't have to get the tubers. And that absolutely will be very effective. Steve, anything to add to that?
Well, we've done a lot of work in Pittsburgh, and I know there's some complexity to the terrain there, maybe in some of the old slag slopes where the steel mills used to drop their byproducts. So there's a lot more heat on the ground. There's a lot more, depending on the site you're working on, obviously. So if whoever sent that message wants to give me a call, we can talk it through as well. I think Stephen's answer is very, very true. Just, you know, again, things can be very site specific too. So.
Moving along on that point about site specificity. So this person is, you know, controlling kudzu in New York State, and they have a few sites that they haven't controlled yet due to erosion concerns, where areas where kudzu is growing on very steep slopes or sand dunes. Do you have any recommendations on how to deal with these kinds of sites and how to control kudzu without causing further erosion problems?
Well, obviously, I mean, really anywhere we're taking something out, we have to think what was there before or what do we want to have there afterwards. So many times when we're dealing with invasive plants, that erosion concern isn't really a concern. With kudzu, it might be more so depending on how long the plant infestation has been there. But oftentimes there are things growing under there already. So you need to determine that first, what's growing underneath there. And will there really be a problem? And if you think there is, you just need to be prepared. I mean, your choice is to have kudzu there or take out the kudzu and put something back, you know, or let nature do its job and bring something back, whatever might be there. So that's kind of a general answer. But again, one of those where I'd love to see the pictures or love to take a look at the site and really give you some very specific answers on. But there's times when we've treated kudzu where we've gone right back in and put down just a seasonal ryegrass just to help control the erosion until we know what else we want to put in there. There's other times we haven't had to put anything because there's other grasses and forbs and other things that are growing in there that we don't have to worry about.
Yeah, I'd say ryegrass seed is probably the cheapest thing to throw down for immediate soil conservation. You know, it's not a native seed mix for sure, but just to get something, if you're concerned about that, ryegrass tends to thrive pretty well in areas where kudzu was controlled because of the nitrogen that's typically there. So, okay.
Great. So I think you might have already kind of answered this question, but I'm going to re-ask it so that this person can get a more specific answer. So you were talking about spraying while it's flowering. Do native insects visit these flowers, and are the herbicides harmful to those native insects?
Okay, great question. So I know there's a lot of concern about pollinators, and so, you know, just from a general, a lot of social concern, a lot of good science in terms of pollinator declines. And so the question comes up regarding the treatment of invasive plants with herbicides over and over. We deal with the beekeepers a lot on this issue, doing a lot of extension to beekeepers who often utilize invasive plants and they're worried about their bees. You know, one of the recommendations typically that are provided is if you are very concerned about native insects or pollinators, to treat pre-flowering or completely post-flowering. So if you have a very distinct flowering season or period within the season, that's easier to do. You know, if it is indeterminate flowering, that's a whole lot more difficult to do. Typically treating kudzu just prior to flowering can be extremely effective because it's sort of done its vegetative growth thing and is then getting ready to ramp up for flowering and sexual reproduction, or pausing and waiting until flowering is over. The one thing you need to be careful about with flowering of kudzu, waiting too late in the fall, if you treat kudzu close to frost, then you will definitely get poor control. So I have never seen good herbicide control was very close to frost. So you may need to make sure you hit the window to have at least a month, I would say, prior to killing frost with any herbicide treatment for kudzu. So I think you do have a bit of a window there with kudzu flowering after that, or certainly before that. So, you know, that's a pretty general recommendation for treating any invasives when there's concern for pollinators, is just to avoid the direct flowering window. But don't go too early. You know, treating when you see the first sprigs of kudzu start to emerge way too early. It's at that point, it's allocating massive reserves from the tubers upwards. And, I like to say it's hard to get the elevator to go down or the herbicide to go down when the elevator is actually coming up, with photosynthates, with sugars being moved upwards into the new vine growth early in the season. Okay.
Great. This next question has a couple of chemical names that I may or may not butcher. Okay, so this person watched a different kudzu presentation where they recommended a bioherbicide, Myrotherium verrucaria. They applied with herbicides such as glyphosate to improve efficacy of control. Do either of you have experience with this and or recommend it?
Excellent question, Steve. Have you used that product before? I have not, but I can give you some general thoughts.
Not to my knowledge. If we've used it, it's not under my supervision.
Yeah. Okay. So bioherbicides are something that some folks have worked on for years now, looked at them for tropical soda apple, for kudzu and other things. So typically glyphosate is going to provide some degree of effectiveness itself. And I haven't seen studies that really demonstrated a benefit of the combination of the two. So I'm not sure what the data says on that actually. So I'm a little hesitant to badmouth it and say don't use it without actually having seen that data. But ideally, ordinarily for a tank mix of products like that to be recommended, then they need to demonstrate that there's a pretty substantial increase, usually about a 20% improvement in control to sort of be meaningful in terms of any efficacy. So I don't have that data in front of me. I'm not sure, if those are published studies or not, but I would say if you've seen it recommended and you are able to experiment yourself with a small amount, then by all means, as a land manager, go for it and try it, put them together and, compare that in a couple of areas next to a couple of areas where you used either one of them alone. And that would allow you to sort of begin to parse out the relative contribution of each of those individual components of the spray mix in terms of their impact. And I think you would see that pretty quickly, whether or not there was going to be a meaningful effect. Okay.
Great. I think you touched on this a little bit before, but I think one of you did. Can you give a more full explanation or example of what you mean by cultural management?
Okay, absolutely. So, the idea of cultural management often comes from other practices that we utilize during land management, that are part of the other land management that we're doing. And that term has evolved to incorporate things like educational, improving educational efforts on invasive plants, so which we advocate for that. I think we all need a little more education and understanding about, specific invasive plant issues. Other aspects might be some people have, sometimes within the world of farming, other cultural weed management practices might incorporate those things that are already being done, like row spacing, crop density, things like that. Those don't directly apply, in terms of natural areas, but the components of it, especially on education, really come across. If you think about other things you're doing in natural area land management, those could be perceived. One thing, a big one, is introducing new pests. And so the work you're doing to prevent seed movement, so don't contribute to the problem by facilitating the spread of other invasives. So working hard on sanitation of your equipment, of your boots and socks and things like that. Those can fall under cultural or preventative type strategies that are coming across. So prevention falls under that cultural category.
A couple of people have had some questions on stump spray versus foliage spray effectiveness, and whether or not stump spraying is, not as effective as cutting at eye level. So if you could speak a little bit to that, that'd be great.
Sure.
Steve, I'll let you take the first stab at that one.
Okay. Yeah. So you saw those tubers, how long they were. Our goal is to get the herbicide down as far into the root system as possible. really stump treatments, I believe, have evolved over time. When they first came out with some of these herbicides, the treatment was foliar application because it goes down through the foliage and it really gets in there and lets the plant kind of be alive while everything's going through there. When we start cutting things, the plant kind of shuts down a little bit more. So I think stump treatments work better on shallow rooted plants. If you're doing, bushy species, things like that, it works pretty well. When we have something with such a root system like kudzu, it's just not as effective. Chasing vines into the forest, into the canopy, away from the main patch, we will cut and treat the stump that's really big, that's going into the ground at that point. But when we're giving the haircut around the base, you're just treating the foliage that lands on the ground. You're not going to be treating any stumps off of that. But yeah, when you're chasing things back into the forest and there's a few of them that go back like that, then that kind of takes that vine out at least. So you're still going to have to go back there and probably spray it once it resprouts though. But it won't have as much sun either. So,
yeah, that's a good answer. I'd say if you're going to the trouble of cut stumping, could you not saw the root crown? Just take it one step further and go ahead and cut that root crown out.
Yeah, if you're going to go through the whole forest and do it that way, yes. But
yeah,
you saw that one little patch you made.
Yeah.
There,
Yeah. Like I said, only small, very small.
But maybe in the Northeast where it's just getting into establishing and they're smaller, you're doing more EDRR, that might be a good way to do it.
Yeah.
Thanks for that answer. So do you have any specific advice for sites that have a very extremely steep slope directly uphill from a busy road and how you would approach a situation like that?
I'd have to have more information, honestly. Where is it rooted? Is it just hanging over the slope? Is it actually rooting all through the slope? We've done that before. Chattanooga is a great example for kudzu and a lot of invasive species. They have so many of them. They have a lot of slopes. And we've actually had to get ropes and rappel down and work in different areas that way. But most of the time you can take care of it from the top down in a scenario like that. But if it's more of a gradual slope and it's actually in the ground all the way down, then you're going to have to find a way to spray into that. Maybe close the road and spray from the road up and then spray from the top down. Just kind of safety first, I guess, in any scenario like this.
Great. Can you talk a little bit more about the hot water treatments that you talked a little bit about in your presentation?
Sure.
And where you can purchase those, and if you have any companies that you would like to recommend?
You bet. We've been working with a group called Heatweed. They're out of Europe, and he's been at our innovations conference for several years now. We've looked at the equipment. We actually purchased our first hot water treatment system this year. So I think we might have one of the first of theirs in the country. Now is to actually experiment with it and test it and see what it works on and what it doesn't. At the conference this year in December, we sprayed it on English ivy and euonymus on the ground. And I just went back there last week to look at it, and it actually really knocked back those plants where we sprayed. And it's purely hot water. There's nothing else to it. There's no foam added. There's nothing. It's just hot water. They've just figured out a way to regulate that heat at the perfect temperature for certain species. And one of the benefits about it is you can spray it in a schoolyard while kids are playing. You can spray it next to the water or in the water. It's hot water. So there's a lot of benefits to it, but we're trying to figure out what it works best on. Kudzu is one of the few species I probably would say, well, I don't even know if we should try. It's just the way that it grows, but there might be some use for it. It's just a matter of how. So if anyone's interested in knowing about the products, we have all kinds of information about that particular one. I'd love to send it to you. And there might even be opportunities where we can come up and do a demonstration, do a little half-day workshop or something. Try it, see what it works on, see if it works on the species.
Well, I just wanted to, I'm going to jump in now because we're now at 20 after the hour, and I'm so grateful, Stephen and Steve, for this fantastic presentation and for all your really thorough and thoughtful answers to our participants' questions. It seems that both of you are willing to have people email you. So please get in touch with Steven or Steve if you have further questions. We're also, like I said, going to make this recording available if you want to go back and review any parts of it. Thanks again. And if you want to check out the RISC network, Justin put the RISC website in the chat box. So please do look at some of our resources there, and you can also find the recording there. So with that, we'll conclude this. Have a wonderful day. And thanks again to our speakers and all the participants with all your great questions. Take care now.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, thank you.